This is a CBS News special report. I'm Jeff Glow reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York. Good day. There is a verdict in the sexual assault retrial of Bill Cosby, and Cosby has been found guilty on all 3 counts, we are told. Jerika Duncan is at the courthouse in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Cosby was charged with 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault of Andrea Constand in January of 2004. And Jerika, I know you've been watching this entire trial. Give us an update.
Well, I think obviously this is a win for the Cosby camp and a big loss for those who were hoping to see Bill Cosby behind bars and serve time for these alleged sexual assaults. Now, this happened relatively quickly when you look at what happened with the last trial. It was a hung jury. They could not reach a verdict, and they deliberated for more than 5 days. In this case, the jury started deliberating yesterday around 11 o'clock in the morning. They asked at least 2-3 questions about the consent. What does consent mean? They also wanted statements reread to them made by Andrea Constand, made by Bill Cosby. So there were some questions early on, and that was typical of what we saw in that first trial. But again, they deliberated within the last 2 hours and came to this decision, as you just mentioned, aggravated indecent assault. There were 3 counts. Bill Cosby found guilty on all 3 counts, each count facing up to 10 years behind bars. We imagine his attorneys will appeal this decision, but now we're just waiting for his attorneys to come out, as well as the district attorney, Kevin Steele, and people who have been here in support of Andrea Constand. Remember, there are dozens of women who've made allegations against the comedian and actor who is 80 years old, and 5 of those people were able to testify at this trial. That did not happen at the last trial. They only had 1 witness, known as trying to prove prior bad acts was the legal terms there. It sounds as though we're now going to go to Mr. Cosby's spokesperson. I hear him in my ear. I'm not sure if we have that, Jeff.
All right.
Mr. Cosby's spokesperson,
Jerika,
Andrew White, I believe, is at the mic.
Great, Jerika, thanks very much. We will get back to you very quickly. Appreciate it. As we wait for someone to speak at the microphone there, we're also joined by Dennis McAndrews on the phone, a well-known attorney in the area who's been following this case very, very closely. Dennis, if you're with me, let me just get your reaction.
Now, the verdict, as it's been reported, is guilty of all 3 counts, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Yes. That is obviously the result of extraordinary work on the part of the prosecution. This was an extremely difficult case from a prosecutorial perspective. The inconsistencies that plagued them in the first trial did not go away in the second trial. The issue of the large monetary settlement that she received was something that the defense used to call her a con artist, to call her a pathological liar. They threw every conceivable issue possible at this case, including the statute of limitations. So there was a huge amount of information for this jury to pour through. And for the prosecution to have prevailed is really a fairly extraordinary result, even with the other women, because their allegations were very old. They had not been reported to the police, and so it's a significant prosecution victory.
You mentioned the others, so 5 other women were allowed to testify at this trial who were not allowed to testify at the previous trial. This trial in particular, Dennis, as you know, there were 12 days of testimony this time, but then jurors just started deliberating at 11 a.m. Yesterday. So, I mean, there are a lot of differences in these 2 cases, one of which is the amount of time that jurors deliberated. Obviously, a different result in this one as well. How much do you read into how much time they took to deliberate, and also some of the questions that they asked both last night and this morning?
Yeah. I think in terms of the questions, it showed that there were a number of jurors who, really were thinking hard and really had not made up their mind and needed some refreshment in terms of the critical parts of the evidence to decide which way they were going to go. In terms of the length of deliberation, I think from a practical perspective, it's important to remember that this case, even though it was long and it was complicated and had a great deal of testimony, it involved a criminal act that took about 5 minutes. And there was one fundamental question. Did she agree to let a man who was the age of her grandfather to engage in sexual contact with her? And the jury had to look at themselves in the mirror and say, despite every inconsistency and despite the money, does this make sense? Would she really have permitted to do that, him to do that? And apparently their answer was no. She would not have consented to that.
Okay. Andrew, or Dennis McAndrews, excuse me, stay with us if you would please, as once again we have a verdict in the retrial of Bill Cosby, accused of assaulting Andrea Constant more than a decade ago. Bill Cosby, we have just learned, has been found guilty on all 3 counts. Jerika Duncan remains outside the courthouse. She's been following this case throughout, and the last trial for that matter. Jerika, why in particular did they choose the Andrea Constant case?
Well, in this particular case, this was the last one that prosecutors knew of that fell within the statute of limitations here in Pennsylvania. And to go back to where all of this started, some would say it started with a joke made by Hannibal Buress, and then other people started coming out and saying, well, wait, that's not so funny. He actually did that to me. And with social media and all of that, the Associated Press then sought to get the depositions that Cosby gave in 2005 and 2006 from the civil settlement that he did with Andrea Constant. They wanted those documents released, and they were sealed before. The judge in that case decided to release or unseal those documents and making them public. That is where we learned that Bill Cosby had said that he admitted to giving a woman quaaludes that he wanted to have sex with. Well, that then set this county on a mission really to find out if there was enough to charge Bill Cosby with aggravated indecent assault now that they knew that they had his comments, his words that were made public from the deposition, and that's what they did. So that document was released. The depositions were released in July of 2015, and by the end of 2015, in December of 2015, again, the key here is the statute of limitations had not run out on Andrea Constant's case. They decided to charge Bill Cosby with aggravated indecent assault, 3 counts. With those 3 counts, he's facing up to 10 years with each count. So that's sort of how we got to where we are today. Again, a big win for the people who've been supporting Andrea Constant, of course, for Andrea Constant. And you might recall when there was a hung jury in the first case, she posted something on Twitter of her shooting a basketball and saying, always follow through. Well, she seemingly followed through in this case in getting a conviction. But again, we do expect Bill Cosby's lawyers to appeal that.
And as the appeal, as you mentioned, he faces up to 5 to 10 years in prison for each one of these charges, Jerika, but they could be combined potentially if the judge follows state sentencing guidelines. We have been told conviction would likely put Cosby, who is 80 right now, in prison until he's at least 85 years old. Again, the breaking news at this hour from Pennsylvania: Bill Cosby has been found guilty on all 3 counts in the Andrea Constant case. The jury has been deliberating for 12 days of testimony, I should say, they heard. They have been deliberating since yesterday at 11 a.m. They stayed until just a little after 9 p.m. last night, came back this morning, asked a question, and then we got news that the verdict was in. But clearly, while it involved some of the same allegations, this was a different trial and a different case in many ways. New attorneys, new approaches. Jerika, you have some other details there?
Absolutely. Yeah, just hearing from reporters inside the courtroom that Bill Cosby is stoic and that there are alleged victims in there crying, as well as, I believe, Andrea Constant, very emotional. I'm sure they're going to be coming out and speaking with us relatively soon. But I can just tell you, even speaking with some of the people, again, who were here, who supported Andrea Constant, they have been paying very close attention to this case, and we're hoping for what we're now seeing today, which is a conviction on all counts in this retrial.
All right.
Jeff?
Jerika, thanks very much. To repeat, Bill Cosby guilty today of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. The verdict by the jury of 7 men and 5 women came on the second day of deliberations in Pennsylvania after 12 days of testimony. Bill Cosby could get as much as 10 years in prison on each count. More later on this CBS station and your local news. I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.